oppressors and I call it common.
Thorvek pressed his full weight onto the witch, who lay on the alley's rough ground. He pinned the psyker's arms beneath his knees and smothered the man's mouth so that no curses could be spat. From the alley's mouth, Holland looked back nervously. Thorvek muttered a prayer, hurried but heartfelt, before swiftly drawing a blessed dagger across the man's thick neck. The cut was clean, efficiently made, and blood welled out immediately. It flowed over the man's neck and down the alley, before pooling in a stinking, litter-choked drain that was already buzzing with cryptolids. The witch's convulsions ceased with a final spurt of bloody froth that covered Thorvek's apron. He swore silently. Evidence. They had prepared for this problem, but it was still something Thorvek could have avoided if the Imperial lapdog now dead beneath him hadn't been so damned strong. He could have covered his throat as planned. Goethe would deal with it. Patamine, bless her. She was incredibly skilled in swiftly excising incriminating stains and dyes out of the most impliable fabric. So skilled, in fact, that senior leaders from other cells of the Mind Cord, even beyond Thorvek's home city of Grezum, begged for her training as often as secrecy would allow. Home city. Not for long, he thought. Not now that salvation was on its way. It meant a better life for all of the faithful of the cult of the Mind Cord, not least for Thorvek, for kind-eyed Goethe, and for the small star angel she was swiftly bearing to term. At the alley's edge, Holland shifted incessantly from foot to foot. The lookout was constantly on edge, it seemed, at least when not in the pastor's presence. Holland's eyes and ears were the best in the cell, though. Working out on the slag fields on the outskirts of Grezum meant his eyesight and hearing were incredibly sharp. They had to be, for all sorts of predatory life stalked the slag. "You done?" he hissed back at Thorvek, eager to get out of such an enclosed space. Thorvek swiftly signed for the lookout to wait. He placed the tip of the blessed dagger upon the psyker's forehead, still warm and caked in grimy sweat, and drew a wafer-thin rag of filthy cloth from his overall. Thorvek consulted the simple image scratched in charcoal on the rag, and began to carve an identical one into the witch's head. He made sure that the cuts were jagged, pressing hard to incise the skull beneath, just as the pastor had instructed. Soon the bloody shape of an eye was riven into the psyker's smooth forehead. The red eye mirrored the chalked oculus that Grezum's governor had scrawled on the backs of rounded-up psykers as his troops paraded them on the way to the black camps. More importantly, bloodily carved like this, and with a cleanly slit throat, the mark bore all the signs of the recent vigilante attacks on those bearing even a whiff of sorcery about them. Looking at his work, Thorvek instinctively rubbed his own forehead in the same spot, massaging the tiredness he felt over the shallow bony ridges there. The 5 sacred ridges were his inheritance, dating back all the way to when the serene Paternoster arrived as the emissary of the Star Children. Thorvek felt happy, despite the dull ache. Everything was as the pastor had wished, expressed in the man's mellow voice. Other cells had rather outlandish names for the statuesque man, cognosk or viapator, and to Holland he was always pastor, but Thorvek had been personally invited to address him as the Magus. The Magus, always so admirably in touch with dealings around the city, had told Thorvek and Holland how the governor's expanding corps of witchfinders were equipped with some new off-world tech. The governor had told his councillors that he had negotiated a pact with the Adeptus Mechanicus, but the devices looked like no work of the tech priests. They were smooth, subtly curved, nothing like the Magus's mind-cord contracts had seen before. These psi-hunting bands of armoured agents were trawling dangerous areas of Grayzum in 50-strong gangs, often followed by mobs of hate-filled civilians. Thorvek could sympathise, hating witches intensely. Many loyal brothers and sisters of the mind-cord scattered cells had joined these hunts, helping their fellow Grezzi root out the foulness, even if the rest were unbelievers. Yet imagine such an unthinking mob, the Magus had mused, witnessing the simple and honest miracles gifted to the cult of the mind-cord. What then? These witchfinders too, the oppressors' tools that they were, would they understand? Everything the serene Paternoster had done to save them would be in vain. The Star Children may even turn aside from this world in shame. The Magus had spoken sadly of his worry, and Thorvek had ached to do something to help him. Even the thought of that brief meeting with the Magus warmed Thorvek through. Since his earliest boyish memory of a blessing at the man's hand, Thorvek had seen the guiding light of the cult only a handful of times in person. Yet often did a mental image of the Magus come to mind during vital work for the cult, stealing uniforms, monitoring sentry patterns, exploring possible new sanctums. All were carried out with the reassuring presence of the Magus's eyes in the back of his mind. Thorvek had jokingly told himself the Magus watched Thorvek's dealings through his servant's eyes. Yet, with the miracles the man wrought, who was Thorvek to say that that wasn't exactly what occurred? Psychers, Thorvek thought bitterly. The tyrannical overlords of Grezum sought to buy the docile obedience of its citizens by hunting the witches down, all the while pampering their pet sorcerers. There had been so many more purges recently, but with the oppressors' increased trawls with witchfinders and their off-world tech came the increased risk to the security of the mind-cord cells. It was a blessing, then, a portent, the Magus had called it, that the cult of the mind-cord had been blessed with so many more workers of simple miracles. It was a sign. After all these generations of preparation, it was the sign. "Come on," he called sharply to Holland. The lookout ran to where they had dumped the psyker's body, and together they wove into the darkness of crumbling alleyways. Thorvek liked the wiry man, who was favoured with a violet cast, his hairline just about concealed. "I hate this place," Holland spat. "Why we have to drag that witch all the way out here? This is King Jaren's patch. Even slaggers like me know that. The old smuggler's had enforcers killed before now. He wouldn't think twice if he caught us here." "That's the point. You trust the Magus, the pastor, don't you?" Holland looked appalled. "Yes, of course. You know I do." "Think about it. The cult catch that off-world Imperial witch sniffing around the pastor's private chambers, right? That filthy mind spy gets found here, shanked by witches. Now that we've got loyalty in the mobs, they'll make sure he's discovered by the witchfinders. But King Jaren isn't some lowlife the governor can walk over. The witchfinders tramp here, there'll be war." "Yeah," They will. Thorvek grinned and slapped his friend's lumpen back as he saw realization dawn. It's happening, Hall. In our lifetime, it's finally happening. The oppressors will be slaughtered. Pantomime, Holland breathed. He smiled in ecstasy, pointed yellow teeth gleaming. Less than a week later, Gresham burned. To Thorvek's awe, the serene Paternoster's tireless agents across the entire continent had revealed their hand as one united people. Gresham convulsed in the throes of a war between the city governor and the huge resources of King Jaren's criminal under-empire. Their former backroom agreements swept aside in blood. The city didn't blaze alone. From his vantage point, at a high window of a derelict factorum, Thorvek saw at least 3 satellite cities in flame. How he wished his grandfather could have laid his lidless eyes on the scene, known this moment. Below Thorvek, the briefest of violent sparks flared. Ascension hour had come at last. His perfectly executed luring of the murdered Imperial investigator had earned Thorvek high praise. Now he led what would be the cult's first open blow against the Oppressor. Thorvek stalked down the abandoned factorum, and, like oily shadows, the fighters of his cell slipped along in his wake. By the time they poured silently out of a rear loading bay, almost 30 dedicated brothers and sisters of the cult of the Mind Cord crept alongside Thorvek. In the twilight, greasy rain soaked them. They looked ragtag, their grime-smeared surf coveralls layered over stolen flak jackets. Bolt-action rifles, brutalist autoguns, and even antique hunting aquabuses were born in a mismatch of firepower. They were nothing like the recent propaganda vids spewed by the governor, with his honour guard at practice ranges in neatly pressed uniforms, firing their new Grayson pattern plasma long rifles. Stolen vidlogs from the governor's chambers had also shown him cajoling the city's wealthy with tales of new backers. He jabbered of better weapons for the city-state militars, off-world investment, and global unity. Thorvek's target was an outer defence post of the city militar. Its unimportance made it the ideal mark. They didn't have anyone inside this particular post. Its clique of politicised neptists had proven hard to infiltrate, but there were always ways to overcome any problem, as the Magus often told them. Crouching near the gate in its outer perimeter, Thorvek signalled. Regan, her angelic purple features hidden beneath a militar helm, entered her passcard in the brass reader. With gloved digits, she punched in the code whose acquisition had cost an unbelieving colleague his life. She casually covered the locking mechanism as she passed through, letting the heavy gate close behind her as she walked with her characteristic awkwardness to the post's door. Regan looked up at the skull-faced picked thief above the door. Regan knew from her own shifts at other posts that the images it took were monitored, and those inside would be trying to raise her on a Vox frequency keyed solely to this post. She theatrically tapped to the side of her enclosed helm, beautifully conveying abject and tired frustration, as well as a supposedly broken Vox bead. After a moment, the defence post's portal opened. Thorvek felt events slow. 2 military guards came out to remonstrate with Regan. They were strained, on edge, and without sleep. The internecine city war hadn't reached the area, but the guards had been posted on endless shifts without hope of relief. The bigger of the guards managed to shout invectives before Regan brought her stub gun up. The guard's face disappeared in a roar of heavy slugs, and the back of his helmet erupted in a shower of blood, brain matter, and sharp shards of bone. The other guard didn't turn and flee, surprising Thorvek, but the woman was doomed nevertheless. In a tide of bodies, Thorvek's Selkin poured through the gate that Regan's inserted scramble emitter had prevented from locking. The guard shot Regan with a kind of slim-nosed plasma pistol that Thorvek didn't recognize, but then took too long fumbling for her Vox bead contact and was ripped apart by the Mind Cord's devoted liberators. Another of Thorvek's squad scooped up the pass card from Regan's dead hand without so much as a glance at her. She was a blessed martyr, but she would be reincarnated with all of the others when the Star Children arrived. Her actions would allow them to sever this post's connections with the capital, draw whatever forces the governor could spare out here to the lonely fringe, and leave the entire city at the mercy of the Mind Cord, waiting in the ancient sewers beneath. The pass card opened the defense post's portal, and Thorvek's squad poured the hail of shot inside. 2 of his fighters were hit by the immediate return fire, rapidly firing streams of blue plasma torching them. The smell of the warriors' burnt flesh washed over the fighters who followed, stampeding over their dying Selkin with hisses and shouts. Inside the interconnected command rooms, signal housings, armories, and billets, the savage fighting was far closer than Thorvek had anticipated. The 20 or so sleep-deprived guards should have been swarmed in moments. Instead, they braced themselves around the gantries, covering each other in a way that Thorvek had never seen before. Many more zealous cult fighters fell to the guards' fire, chests and heads flash-burning in the volleys of plasma pulses. The guards' unified cohesion could not save them, though, not against such determined liberators as Thorvek's. His brothers and sisters poured rattling automatic fire into the post's guards, tore out throats with angel-touched talons, and drove knives into the hearts, eyes, and lungs again and again. Barely 10 of Thorvek's warriors survived, and he could not share their joyous celebrations at finally overcoming the collaborators of the Oppressor. Thorvek's mind churred with everything that was wrong inside the defense post. The guards had used the oddly proportioned plasma weaponry, meant to be so new it was only held by the governor's own honor guard. This was an outer defense post, manned by dregs, yet they'd fought with selfless cohesion. What then? The governor's own Praetorians? A heretical thought surfaced. Had the cult of the Mind Cord underestimated the oppressors? A stained chapbook stuck out of the breast pocket of the guard at his feet, above which blood continued to flow from the ragged stump of the man's neck. Thorvek flicked through its yellow pages, trying to order his thoughts. "There is a unity to which we can all belong," he read. "A higher purpose, a greater good." In Thorvek's mind, the Magus's dark eyes opened.